everyone. Thank you very much for coming along. We're looking today at some of the implications after Paris, at what we can expect in a world after the Conference of Parties 21 in Paris. In fact, we're going to see a lot of things happening very quickly, but largely because of what wasn't agreed upon in Paris. Paris was a very significant step diplomatically, but in fact, it's not going to amount to much in terms of actually reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Several people have pointed this out, including the scientists who were really quite disappointed at what didn't happen in Paris. But also the NGO community, the non-governmental organizations, have been keeping track of things like the impact on agriculture and water supplies and refugees, the movement of peoples, especially as severe weather and increasing sea level starts to register itself in the lives of people around the world. This is what's going to be a world that we have to face, whether or not the Accord succeeds in eventually reducing carbon. So we're going to look at this whole question of what comes after Paris, COP21 as it's known, or the Conference of Parties, the 21st Conference of Parties. And we're going to look at agricultural stress that is likely to be coming out of the non-reduction of carbon, because the Paris Accord didn't really firmly commit anyone to reduce the amount of carbon emissions. And we're going to look at the way that agricultural stress is going to lead to food insecurity and an increasing demand worldwide for what's being called climate justice. This is the new phrase that's emerged out of all of these meetings, from particularly the meetings of the Conference of Parties in Durban, South Africa, where it became apparent that climate justice was the issue at stake. And that was well before the Paris agreements. That was in 2011, and by 2015 in Paris, there hadn't been much movement on this whole question of climate justice, but the vocabulary hasn't gone away. Now, you recall what happened in December 2015. It was all very celebratory at the time.
I see the reaction is positive. I see no objections. The Paris Agreement is adopted. The prop of a gavel by French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius culminates several nights of haggling and years of paralysis on the question of climate change. Cheers erupted among the delegates of nearly 200 nations who, for the first time ever in a 31-page document, agreed on how to move forward to curb global warming.
Well, that's the official Voice of America account of it. They agreed how to move forward to curb global warming. Well, there's no mention of curbing carbon emissions by this particular reporter, and with good reason, because actually there wasn't much commitment to reducing carbon. They referred to the intended nationally determined commitments, or referred to as INDCs, as indicating that there should be a reduction, but if they were all added up, and people like Kumi Naidoo actually did add up the commitments that national governments were determined to commit to, they actually add to carbon in such a way that the prediction of scientists is that there will actually be a 3.7 degrees centigrade increase in global temperature. This is why he refers to the Paris Agreement as having a lot of loopholes in it. Loopholes in the Paris deal created, in effect, in his terms, a structure of global climate apartheid. Look at his assessment in the interview he gave to Amy Goodman. Take a look.
Kumi, you were there last night. Why did you gather hundreds of people saying no to the draft Paris Accord?
Well, there's so many loopholes in that draft text. You could fly Air Force One through it. I mean, bottom line is it's lacking in ambition. It has lots of options which might give a false sense of complacency that there's lots to fight for. But importantly, I think we should acknowledge that everybody who has participated in the climate protest over the last couple of years, they can take some comfort from the fact that 1.5 as a goal is alive still. It would not have been there had it not been for the activism that we have seen around the world. However, if 1.5 is not backed up with clear long-term goal of how we phase out from fossil fuels by 2050, the commitments that governments have made in terms of emissions, when you add it all up, it's taking us to a 3.7 degree world. So basically, you know, it just doesn't add up to the level of ambition and a sense of urgency that we need to see.
Okay, well, you can see the sense of disappointment right there at the conference. If you add up the amount of carbon that they say they're going to restrain themselves to, it still doesn't anywhere near achieve the reduction needed to keep the climate from going in a kind of runaway greenhouse mode into warming areas that we've never seen as a human species, certainly as an organized agricultural species. And as he points out, this lacked ambition is the way it was referred to, because in effect it says it won't do anything for the way things have to be restrained until after 2050. It's really quite staggering.
Bottom line is, I would say that the fingerprints of the fossil fuel industry is in far too many places on this draft text.
Like where?
Well, basically in terms of trying to push the dates for decarbonization beyond 2050, because you see, they want that so they can go into orgy of fossil fuel burning over the next couple of decades. Right now, the science is very clear. Extreme weather events are telling us that we are running out of time. Lives are being lost now. You know, while we're here, we saw what happened in Chennai. We are seeing huge devastation in the Philippines on an ongoing basis. My continent in Africa is suffering from climate-induced desertification and so on. And you know, quite frankly, there is a bigger responsibility for developed countries. And I feel, and this is not a comfortable thing to say, that if London, Paris, Washington, Brussels were facing as urgent the situation that we are facing in the developing parts of the world, I don't think we'll be having such a struggle to get the kind of ambition that we need and the goal of, you know, reaching 100% renewable energy by 2050 and access for all.
So are you saying there's racism involved?
Well, people can draw whatever they want from that. There is no question that most of, you know, I've used the term climate apartheid before. I've said that, you know, it's uncomfortable that the way the biggest historical responsibility lies is not where the first and most brutal impacts are actually being faced, and the demography of that is clear. You know,
And you were an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa.
Yeah, and I mean, what people need to, the negotiators now in the remaining 36 hours, they need to understand nature does not negotiate, they cannot change the science, all they can change is political will. And what is at stake here is not some ethereal thing called the planet. This is a fight for our children and their children's futures, and there is absolutely no sense of intergenerational solidarity other than in some nice words that we heard from the heads of state, and there's a total disconnect between what the heads of state said in the first 2 days of the talks and how the conversations have since proceeded in the negotiations.
You said you could drive U.S. Air Force One through the loopholes. Are you suggesting the U.S. is involved with stopping any kind of actual meaningful accord?
Well, I think, you know, if you have to rate how the US behaved in Copenhagen and how they behaving here, there's an improvement overall. But there are many things, like on loss and damage, the US is the biggest blocker in terms of ensuring that poor countries who do not contribute to the problem, who are facing devastating impacts, and are saying we need support, we need compensation, we need insurance. And the US, there's no question, is the biggest blocker in my mind.
So they're saying no? The US is saying no?
Yeah.
Okay. We didn't get this in the reports from the American press. In fact, the American press didn't even cover the conference, but the Western press in general didn't emphasize that there was no provision for loss and damage. They completely sidestepped that issue. It's just as if it was back in 2009 when the United States made a huge mistake internationally and declared that it had no responsibility. Well, actually, it said that they were responsible for the carbon, but they're not going to do anything about it. The idea of compensation or anything having to do with that was made clear by the main envoy to the conference in 2009. In effect, there's been no shift from what he said then. America's position was made clear in Copenhagen in 2009 and reinforced in Paris with no loss or damage provisions. Take a look.
Here in Copenhagen, the U.S. has rejected...
Now, this is the Copenhagen 2009, where they rejected calls for
the payment of climate reparations to poorer countries for the devastation wrought by global warming. Reparations advocates say the U.S. and other industrialized nations owe a debt to poorer countries for the effects of decades of emissions. On Wednesday, the lead U.S. negotiator, Todd Stearns, said he categorically rejects the principle of climate debt.
We absolutely recognize our historic role in putting the emissions in the atmosphere up there that are there now, but the sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I categorically reject that.
Well, that's a very neat trick to recognize our role, but categorically reject any sense of responsibility. Well, as Kumi Naidu underscored, the loopholes in the Paris deal are so bad that we really have to think about what the world is going to look like, because physics doesn't negotiate, as he says. Science doesn't negotiate. What kind of world can we predictably expect to live in from this Paris deal? That's the remaining question. And it's not very encouraging if you look at it. Just look at the way it was covered. Just a 2 degrees increase, which we're on track to already achieve without any further action. That is, even if we committed to total reduction of carbon at this point, which nobody has, we'd still be baked in, as it were, the transformation of 2 degrees. So you've already achieved 1, and there's so much momentum in the system that it will continue. And from that, we're expected to have increased agricultural dust bowls, no water for millions of people, and nations under threat. This is really quite extraordinary for what's already going to happen. This isn't some sort of harebrained suggestion of a futuristic possibility. This is already underway. Take a look.
2 degrees is the target for limiting the global temperature increase, but if greenhouse gas emissions were halted now, temperatures would still rise by up to 1 degree Celsius. 6,000 years ago, temperatures were at this level, and America's Midwest was a desert. The world's food production centres will become barren again. In this future, mountains lose their glaciers and rivers vanish, the Indian subcontinent fighting for survival. A 1 degree temperature increase could eliminate fresh water for a third of the planet within 85 years.
Now that's absolutely staggering. Just 1 degree centigrade increase could eliminate fresh water for 85% of the planet. This is the kind of transformation that's going to be happening because physics doesn't negotiate. It doesn't matter what humans put their signatures to in Paris. Oh yes, sometime in the future we might commit to these emission reductions targets after 2030. Much too little, much too late. This is what's so staggering about it. This is already underway.
Warming at the poles happens faster than the global average. 40% of Arctic sea ice has disappeared in the last 30 years. While ice reflects heat, oceans absorb it. So as ice melts, the process becomes self-reinforcing. More ocean surface means more heat absorbed, which raises temperatures, making ice less likely to reform. Mountainous regions are at greater risk of landslides as the permafrost which held them together for thousands of years melts away. Low-lying countries like the Maldives are submerged as sea levels rise, and countries already hit by hurricanes face ever greater storms. At a 2-degree rise, people begin to die in what are now considered normal summers. In 2003, with temperatures 2.3 degrees above average, 52,000 people died across Europe. Plant growth slows down, then stops. They don't absorb carbon dioxide as efficiently, instead emitting it. The extra carbon sees global warming spiral out of control. 125,000 years ago, when temperatures were 2 degrees higher, sea levels were up by 6 metres. Today, that extra water makes up our polar ice, which is melting. By the year 2100, sea levels could rise by a metre, displacing 10% of the world's population. In this 2-degree future, ecosystems across the globe collapse as species migrate and fall out of sync. A third of all life on Earth faces extinction. Scientists say we can still avoid a 2-degree rise if we limit our carbon emissions to no more than 2.9 trillion tonnes. We've already used 1.9 trillion tonnes, we have 1 trillion left to use between now and forever. At the current rate, we'll use it in just 21 years.
Well, this is something that was put out in England for the public to see on Sky News, and you can see that's just for 2 degrees. Now, we're predicted to go into a 3.7 degree increase, according to what Kumi indicated there earlier, and that is going to have extraordinary implications for the redistribution of water on the Earth's surface. That, in turn, as we've been warned by Lester Brown here at Harvard just recently, that in turn is going to impact agriculture very directly. Take a look.
I think we're in transition from an age of abundance and surpluses to one of scarcity. Throughout the last half of the last century, the big problem was surpluses. We had these huge stocks that we had accumulated, and the market simply wasn't big enough to absorb them. But as we neared the end of the century, that began to change. We've seen corn and soybean prices reach all-time highs. It's not a situation that's going to go away.
Now, this is absolutely crucial. That is, there may be years which are better than others, and prices may look like they're high and then come down the next year, look like they're high. You've got to look at the way they're ratcheting up over time. And the implications of that are staggering, because in effect what we're going to be creating is the climate apartheid that Kumi Naidoo referred to, registered in terms of water distribution and food production potential. A lot of the areas in the third world that have production potential are right there at sea level. And they're the ones that are going to be drawn out of production, as salinization makes it impossible to grow crops in those areas. Those populations then become migrants, and international migrants are a net drain on a food supply. They don't add to food. They get put in camps, and food is provided for them. So very quickly, the balance between humans and food is disrupted, and it's going to lead to a crisis which Lester points to. Take a look.
Afford to buy enough wheat or rice or corn, whatever they're eating, to have even one meal a day. So it's just amazing to see that in a country like the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Nigeria or Ethiopia, that a substantial percentage, can be 12 to 20, 24% of the families now plan foodless days. This is really a new step in the tightening of the world food supply. I don't think most political leaders are aware of how tight things are getting for the low-income populations of the world. My goal was to be neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic. We're in a difficult situation. Climate change presents a huge threat to future food security. And I think we should be mobilizing to cut carbon emissions fast. And by fast, I don't mean 80% by 2050. The game will be over long before then. I mean 80% by 2020.
Now, cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2020 was nowhere near the ambition of those in Paris. They're talking about 80% by 2050. And as Lester says, the problem will be over by then because we will have missed filling the food gap. And in effect, by 2020, it's going to be very clear, just 4 years away, we've got an extraordinary food crisis. Jean Ziegler has kept an eye on this.
Jean Ziegler, I'm United Nations Rapporteur on the right to food and author of the book The Empire of Shame. A horrible catastrophe is unfolding today on the planet due to the explosion of staple food prices, worldwide prices in the world. Bioethanol is one of the reasons why the food prices explode. Last year, the United States of America burned 138 million tons of maize to transform it into bioethanol and biodiesel. Burning food today as to serve the mobility of the rich countries, this is a crime against humanity.
Now, that's very strong language. But basically, it's pointing to the fact that we're using corn not to feed people. We're using corn to make ethanol to put in the tanks of our SUVs. Now, here's the UN rapporteur for food saying, listen, that's a crime against humanity. Because, in effect, it's our cars versus their lives. That's an extraordinary statement, and the U.S. doesn't normally consider itself as committing a crime against humanity, but we better start looking at this international, in effect, climate apartheid that's driving us into a huge contest for climate justice. Okay, what comes after Paris 21? Look at the agricultural stress that will emerge, the loopholes in the Paris deal, the food gap that's going to emerge from it, and the accusation of climate injustice because of the way in which we're using agricultural resources to supplement our car driving at the same time that millions of people are falling short of food. This is an extraordinary convergence of events, but we've got to realize that even if they did nothing in Paris, and they congratulated themselves on doing a lot, but it seems like in reference to actually reducing carbon, they did nothing. And in the process, the inevitable collapse of agriculture due to the redistribution of water and human populations is going to lead to the kinds of food insecurity and demand for climate justice on a global scale we've never actually seen. In fact, the whole human community needs to focus on food security as part of the transition studies we need to undertake.